particularly around homelessness. Around housing, because as we all know, and we've learned from experience around Europe, it's the housing that's the answer to homelessness. If we don't, the best services in the world supporting people out of homelessness won't work unless we have homes for those people. And in terms of people coming into homelessness, we need affordability in the housing system so that people can afford to stay in their homes and they're not pushed out by excessive rents, and we need supply so there's enough homes there for people to be able to afford them. So I'm delighted to have a great panel this morning. But before we move to that, we have also got a short message from the Minister, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here today in person, but he did provide us with a recorded message, which I'm going to play in advance, and then we'll get started with our first panel. So I'm going to if the admin could allow me to share.
Dave Galere, I want to thank you very much for inviting me here today to speak at the Simon Communities in Ireland National Conference, which marks the beginning of Simon Week. It's an important part of your annual calendar. I know that, where events and activities take place to raise awareness of homelessness and of the really vital services that you and Simon provide in this area. Simon communities across Ireland are playing an extremely important role in addressing the enormous challenges that have faced us in recent years in the areas of housing and homelessness. And these challenges, are wide-ranging and complex. However, the more than 50 years of experience Simon has in this sector allows you to make a real and impactful difference in the lives of more than 18,000 people every year. The description of the work of Simon Communities is very apt. Homelessness is one of the greatest challenges facing our country today, and it is a challenge we in government are committed to addressing. Our partners such as the Simon Communities are key in our joined up approach to addressing homelessness, and that is why I'd really like to thank you again for all the work that you're doing in this vital area. I want to assure you that there is no shortage of will or determination to deal with the issue of homelessness. It remains for me the top priority for my department and for this government. Resources and funding are not an obstacle to the urgent efforts required. Budget 2021 reflects this commitment by allocating nearly €220 million for homelessness services. Indeed, the financial commitment made through Housing for All demonstrates our absolute determination to get to grips with the crisis in front of us. Good progress has been made and continues to be made in reducing homelessness. There have been some monthly increases recently, and I fully acknowledge the need for us to tackle this head on. However, we've seen an overall drop in homelessness of some 17% since October 2019, when numbers were at their highest. Significant progress in particular has been made in the difficult issue of family homelessness. Just in July 2018, there were 1,778 families in emergency accommodation in Ireland. The concerted efforts of those operating on the front lines in the NGO sector, working with our local authorities and backed by my department, has resulted in a 48% reduction in family homelessness over the past 3 years. Put plainly, there are 800 fewer families in emergency accommodation today than was the case 3 years ago. That is why that real and impactful difference looks like, and that is what it looks like on the ground. While this is good to see, we're mindful of the significant challenges that remain, especially as we come out of COVID and get the delivery of housing back on track. This government and my department are acutely aware that there is much more to be done. For those who have left homelessness, we must work to ensure that, where needed, families and individuals are supported to sustain their tenancies. In addition to providing supports to families experiencing homelessness, we must address separately the issue of single people who are homeless. We must ensure that rough sleepers and long-term users of emergency accommodation are supported to exit homelessness. Of course, the issues associated with rough sleeping are never simply solved by providing a house alone, often being compounded by complex mental health, addiction, and other health and social issues. The outreach services that Simon provide are essential in helping the most vulnerable in our society. This work is not easy, and I fully appreciate the work that you are doing on the streets of our towns and cities to help those sleeping rough and to encourage them into shelter. Through this outreach work, Simon are playing an important role in continuing the success of the Housing First programme. Housing for All includes 18 distinct actions tailored to eradicating homelessness, and I'm sure you will see many actions which you are familiar with yourself. As Minister, I'm so grateful for your input and your continued support. The government has committed to maintaining and consolidating the enhanced health service supports for homeless persons, which were put in place in response to the pandemic. As part of the public health response, access to health services for people who are homeless was significantly enhanced. Housing for All will build on this cooperation and coordination, and actions already in place and developed will be maintained. I firmly believe that we can see further reductions in homelessness, but we cannot and we should not get complacent. We must continue to work together to reverse the trend. Simon Communities is at the forefront of this work, operating with my department, housing authorities, other statutory agencies, and other non-governmental organisations to implement initiatives and policies throughout the country. Finally, I'd like to thank you again for allowing me to address you here today. And in particular, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to all the staff and volunteers here today, especially those who are on the front line of homeless service provision.
I think there is, to be fair, a lot to welcome in the homeless section of the plan. And as I say, we will get to that in the next panel. But the first panel is about what's in the housing section of it. How achievable is it? Is it enough? And where do we go from here? So I have three really good speakers who I regularly have the opportunity to collaborate with, and they make a huge, all three of them make a huge input to the work that I do in thinking about how we're going to progress homelessness and how we're going to get the housing we need to do it. So on a personal note, I owe a debt of gratitude to each of the speakers. But so I've decided to share them with you today. So our first is, all three I think are well known to anyone who's interested in housing and watching the media. Our first speaker is Lorcan Sir. And Lorcan is a lecturer and housing policy analyst, contributor to radio and television on housing policy and delivery issues. He's an expert in rental markets in Ireland and abroad, and a member of the Rental Tenancy Board, a research committee, and a board member of the Irish Refugee Council. So over to you, Lorcan.
Thank you, Wayne. I'm always reluctant to when anyone refers to me as an expert, because the more you get involved in housing, the more you realise that you know very, very little. And it's such a multi-headed, you know, it's what's the word, a hydra. You know, you pull a lever in one area and something else happens somewhere else that you don't actually know about. And indeed, your own area. I this morning I was on Clare FM with your Simon community person down in the Midwest, and it's amazing listening to her talk about, you know, the things that you don't realize in housing, and also the you know, the relationship between, I'm just going to talk about housing and housing delivery, the relationship between that and homelessness. So it's a very complicated topic. Wayne asked me before we came on this morning, Wayne just said maybe go through some strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats in the plan, and I was just making some notes myself. So I'm going to just do that for a few minutes. On the strengths thing, you know, I think it's good to have a plan. I think that is really, you know, you can't manage these things without having some sort of a strategy and some sort of a kind of a forward-looking series of KPIs or targets or whatever you want to call it. And I think that in itself is good, and it focuses the mind very much on policymakers when you have to draw up a plan and talk to various people. Now, who the policymakers talk to, I suppose, is a different issue, but it is good to see that. And as the Minister said, and I don't disbelieve him, in fairness, like there is will and determination there. I don't think I don't think any politician wants to see homelessness, or indeed a lack of affordability, or a stagnant housing system, or a dysfunctional one even. I don't think any minister wants to see that. So they're all good. And as Wayne said, there's positive stuff in it, particularly around the homeless, the section on homelessness. And there's obviously some other bits, but the broad strength is that we have a plan to which we can now hold policymakers and ministers to account, and by which we can measure progress. And I'll come back to progress in a minute. The weaknesses, one of the big weaknesses, of course, is that it's market-based still. It still seems to rely on the market for a huge amount, but we know a lot about that, and that's kind of the way these kind of centre-right governments operate, is to rely on the market. But more importantly, one of the weaknesses is we're not really defining what success is in housing, and it's actually, I've never heard it defined. What does success mean in housing policy? Now, typically in other countries, housing policy success is measured. There's three metrics for measuring. The first one is just by counting the number of houses that we build every year. We're kind of pretty much stuck on that level. It's fairly primitive level, just to count the number of the housing output every year. And, we either hit the target of 33,000 or we don't. Success, not success. The second one consists of looking at cohorts. Do we house specific cohorts in our community? And the homeless cohort would be a prime example of that. And so would young households, and so would renters and single people and all that. And we're kind of slowly getting there, but we're still way behind. And the third metric would be looking at individuals. How are individuals? How happy are individuals with their own housing? We're way off that. And the second, I think, weakness is that we're still not articulating, or the policymakers are still not articulating, why housing is a shared public concern. It is really important for lots of levels. It's not just about the number of houses that we build. It's around our pensions and our welfare, and issues around equality and access, and even equality and access to education. Housing has a role to play in that. So that is a weakness, that we're not really articulating success beyond counting house numbers, and we haven't said why housing is something that we should all be concerned about, and all be, I'll never say happy to see our taxes go there, but we should all have a vested interest in seeing decent housing for our own kids and for our families and for everything in life revolves around it. Opportunities, I think there's a lot of opportunities to mop up kind of things that we didn't do properly before, particularly in rebuilding Ireland, or didn't work. And I'm thinking there particularly about regeneration and reuse of existing properties. And there is really an opportunity to do something different out there, and something more. Now, it was disappointing to hear Pascal Donoghue, I was reading about him in the paper yesterday, to say that he doesn't favour grants for redoing, for doing up buildings in towns, and that because it would divert or dilute the attention away from new builds. I mean, that's not the way to do it. There's, hundreds of thousands, well, over 100,000 empty houses around the country that we could use and get back going fairly quickly. So the focus on the new build was kind of disappointing, because it's not all about new build housing. If you're interested in housing people, you'd have grants for accessing second-hand housing as well as new build. If you're interested in supporting the new house building sector, you'd have grants just for new building. So the opportunities are there to do something. And I would have thought it would have been more radical, but I suppose that's the price you pay for being in coalition, that there are always compromises. And as a cynic said to me one time, my definition of compromise is that everybody loses, and that might well be true. But I would have thought it would have been more. It has very much a stamp of Fine Gael won the toss in this one. But anyway, look, it is what it is. I think the threats, the Minister has said that funding won't be a threat to this plan. That's good. We'll see down the line how things work out. It's very hard to predict these things. So we'll kind of wipe that off the threats. The funding is going to be, isn't going to be a problem. I suppose the other kind of threat that I see is the ideology around supply, is that if the measure of success and their whole raison d'etre is about increasing supply, well, then this isn't going to work for lots of reasons. But the supply thing is frustrating in that as Mel well knows, increasing supply has never really brought down house prices. But also, it needs to be the right type of supply. in the right location at the right price. And if you get one of those two things wrong, well, then it's not going to work. There's no point in building tens of thousands of student accommodation when people need, houses to buy, or, tens of thousands of rental accommodation when people are struggling to buy houses for home ownership. And this goes back to the issue earlier on about, the shared public concern. Our housing is all about our welfare. It's the way we look after ourselves in society, our asset-based welfare system. So I think a threat would be that we focus on supply, and we don't look at the broader, more holistic aspects of housing and particular types of supply in particular locations at particular price points. I think that's my 8 minutes up there. I'd say, Wayne, if that is okay for starters.
Thanks, Lorcan. That was a whistle-stop tour, but really informative. You've highlighted a huge number of issues there. So without further ado, I'm going to, because I think you've also segued nicely into Mel, which is going to show what good collaborators you all are. So Mel Reynolds, again, is a regular contributor to news and media around the housing issue, and is a registered architect with more than 25 years experience in project management, conservation, urban design, and developer-led housing. His recent Joint Oireachtas Committee submission included papers on building control and costs in the residential sector and the reuse of vacant buildings. I know a subject close to his heart. He's also a certified passive house designer, and he's done some fabulous things. If you Google him, I'm sure some of the projects he's done have come up. They're very, very impressive. But he's here today to obviously talk about housing for all. And I know he has some very interesting points to make. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Mel. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. Interesting, always interesting to listen to Lorcan there with the overviews of housing. Every day is a school day. And, I've been working in this business for well over 30 years and a little bit more than 25. And I'm still learning about how the whole thing works. So I suppose really the thing about the new housing plan is really, when you're making a new plan, you should look at the old one and do a critical review of the old one and say what worked, what didn't, what do we need to improve, what did we announce, what didn't work out. And I suppose the one area that I would focus on, that I would put a lot of my time looking at, is the delivery of social housing, because it's probably one of the biggest elements of the plan. I think we've 33,000 houses on average per year, which is the outer limit of the ESRI projection. 17,000 are going to be private sector, which is subject to change. That may or may not happen. But I think it's the social housing is the one area where we know the positive from the plan is we have the funding. We know that we have land because an audit was done. We did an audit in 2018, and there's land capacity for around over 49,000 dwellings at old densities, just in local authorities. So we have the two critical aspects are funding and land for delivery. And the local authorities control the process. So effectively, the one part of housing delivery that's in total control of the state is social housing. So I think it's very useful to look at past performance of that and look at what the targets are. So I think the target in the current plan is not an average of 9,500 social homes per year. In addition, there's going to be some cost rental and affordable ones as well, but it's the second biggest component in the new plan. So I have a few summary numbers that I've done, crunching the numbers on the previous 4.5 years, which I think are quite interesting. So the starting point, really the basis of the Rebuilding Ireland plan, was the Joint Oireachtas Committee in 2016, taking you back. And that was prompted by homeless deaths on the street. And really an all-party committee was set up to look at the issue of housing. They got really comprehensive submissions, and the report was published, and it was agreed by all the parties. And the critical target there was 50,000 social homes to be built over the next 5 years. So that then became the basis for a target in Simon Coveney's Rebuilding Ireland plan, which was launched in July 2016. So if we look at the 4.5 years, I have data up until for July till December 2020. So in terms of we know the land capacity nationwide in 2018 was around 48,724 dwellings nationwide. This is land that's zoned residential, that's owned by local authorities. Out of that, the 4 Dublin county councils had enough land for about 29,370 dwellings. So there's a significant amount of land there available for building by local authorities, funded by themselves on their own, totally under their own control. In the 4.5 years of Rebuilding Ireland, the total output of local authorities was 4,326 dwellings. That's it. And in addition, approved housing bodies built about 1,400. So you're looking at around 12% of the land capacity was used by local authorities in that 4.5-year period. In Dublin, the output was even lower. I think in the sort of 5-year period, the average, I think the combined output from local authorities of Dunleary, Rathdown, Fingal, South Dublin, and Dublin City was less than 300 new built homes. Most of the sort of headline figures we hear when ministers and officials are talking about thousands of units being built are turnkeys, which are new homes that are developed on private lands and are purchased by the state or approved housing bodies. So in the same period of the 5,700 actual builds, over 10,000 turnkey homes are purchased from the private sector. So I think the high point in this was 2019, when over 3,700 new homes are purchased from the market. So we can see, you know, in terms of the state influence in the private housing sector, they're a systemic player now because they're buying houses all over the country. And predominantly the turnkey purchases, I think something like 73% were purchased outside Dublin. So in the areas of lowest price and lower demand, that's where the turnkeys happened. And then it looked like HAP and other subventions for leases were in Dublin, you know. So we know that, for example, the output in 2017 in the 4 Dublin local authorities was 233 new dwellings. That's all that was built in the 4 local authorities. By last year, by 2020, the total figure was 269. So we haven't seen that figure of 300 being breached in 4 out of the 5 years. So in terms of the actual new plan, the ambition of 9,500 looks pretty unrealistic. And it's looking at the figures here for the local authorities to actually be building that level of new homes on their own land. They would need to have started approving these a year and a half ago, because there's an 18-month 4-stage approval process, which hasn't happened. So it's quite likely that the way that this will be achieved is through the same models, through turnkey purchases outside Dublin, and also through the leases or HAP within Dublin again. So I suppose that, in combination with some of the discussions about capital funding not being there, would suggest that in the next year or two, we're not going to see any significant change from current housing policy, which is the reliance on leases, which is fine. It's one way to deliver it, but it's very expensive. And we know from deeper, their IG's section have done, I think, 2 audits now looking at costs. And it's twice the price of a build to enter into a subvented lease in areas of high demand like Dublin. So we're in a very difficult place in a way, because the state is hugely important in terms of the lease sector. They're putting an awful lot of money into private leases. I think IG's estimated by 2023 we'd be spending 1.7 billion on subvented leases. At the same time, the state owns significant land banks and they don't seem to be activating it. Like, for example, the capacity in Dublin, in the 4 Dublin local authorities back in 2018, was they have enough land for 29,377 dwellings. And yet only 7% of that capacity has been built out to date. So again, in the plan, quite puzzlingly, there's a whole sections about the state buying more land. And I'm puzzled as to why they're trying to assemble even more land banks when they're clearly not building out what they have at the moment. So I think, you know, in terms of the what's coming down the tracks, is we're probably going to see more of the same. And even in terms of cost rental, sorry, I'm just over the 8 minutes now. The cost rental, according to the housing agency, doesn't seem to work, because if your cost of your unit is 350,000 euros, your cost rental figure at the back end is going to be about 1,990 euros, so about 2,000 euros. So for Dublin City, it looks like cost rental will only work with significant subventions again by the state, which is like HAP. So I suppose the audit, I think the most realistic way of looking at the new plan is that certainly for the lifetime of this government, it's going to continue the current programs and possibly redefine them. So HAP will be called something else. It'll be effectively the same structure. The way that AHBs are delivering units is going to be the same. It may try and pivot towards cost rental, towards non-social housing tenants, but effectively it will be the same mechanism. Okay, so that's that.
Thanks for that, Mel. I think there's an awful lot to consider there, because I think what you're saying is this is very much when it comes to housing an extension of the previous plan, maybe some bells and whistles. But we're going to hold our questions till the end, and I'm just going to move straight on to Orla Hegarty. Again, if you've been in the media or been watching the media, you will, if it comes to housing, you will have heard of Orla, and indeed COVID seems to have taken up a lot of her time as well. And I think it speaks to the fact that most crises, the home becomes the centre of it, and how the importance of home can never be underestimated. Orla Hegarty is course director for the professional diploma in architecture. She'll correct me now if I have this wrong. Orla was previously in architectural practice in Ireland, UK and France, and began contributing to UCD. Registered architect. She's been an examiner for the RIAI professional practice examination. She contributes regularly, as I said, to national broadcast and print media on the subject of the built environment, the construction industry and housing. And she's often appeared as an expert witness to the Oireachtas Committee on Housing. Over to you, Orla.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I'm going to share my screen. It's not heavy on information. It's really just as a background. So hopefully people can see this. Okay, I'm just going to move that over. So thank you very much for the invitation. I have spoken at Simon Communities before, and I'm always happy to give support. I think you do really important work. The first thing I'd like to say this morning is we need to move away from the supply mantra that we've been hearing. We need to move towards affordability. The crisis in housing is in affordability. It's in people losing their homes because they can't afford them. It's in people not moving on or moving into better housing because they can't afford it. It's in overcrowding, which has public health implications. People not taking up education and employment or not availing of them fully because they can't afford housing near their college or near their new job. And we're not going to solve that just with supply in the private market. There's also a little bit of this that's about capacity building as well, which I think I'll come back to as well. So I think the key thing here is that we need housing for everybody. It's not enough to say that we will tweak parts of the market so that it is marginally more affordable for some, or that we will subsidise housing for more people. Because there's a finite limit to that. There's a finite limit by how much you can subsidise people into housing or subsidise them to stay in the housing they're in. And there's a finite limit to the amount of public subsidy that can be put into the system. And I think there's been very little, if any, economic analysis of the new housing programme in terms of what level of public subsidy will be required in order to nudge people into affordability or to incentivise the market to produce what is needed. So I've just looked at a snapshot of Dublin City Council. Obviously, Dublin is the most expensive part of the city of the country. It's probably the area of greatest need. I know we have a large hinterland and suburban area with land, but the city is key to what happens next. Because if it doesn't happen in the city, we're not going to have a sustainable city. We're not going to have mixed communities. We're going to have, again, expansion of low density housing out into the commuter belt. So although the headline figure is 300,000 homes per year in 9 years, which looks very attractive, if you break it down by local authority by year, I've just picked Dublin in 2023 as a sort of snapshot of where Dublin might be going. And it shows the intention is for 42% of the new housing to be social. Now, we know that there is an intention for a lot of that to be leased rather than directly owned by the city. 24% affordable, and that means that people are subsidised to be able to afford housing. 10% new stock in the private rental sector, which really at 504 is a few blocks of modern apartments, probably at high rent. And that only 23% of the market or the system will be private housing. And we know what prices new private housing in Dublin City are at the moment. We're up in the 450, 500,000 apartment range. So what I would take from that is that a third of what's intended in Dublin in 2023, which is sort of the pattern of where this is going, a third of it is intended to be for people who can afford expensive housing, and 2/3 of it is to be very heavily subsidised. I don't think that's sustainable for a city, that 2/3 of the housing would be subsidised. And in fact, over time, looking at what the intention is out towards 2030, it's actually showing the need dropping rather than rising over time. And it's also showing that the percentage of affordable, so subsidised affordable, is intended to increase to almost 30%. So 3 in 10 buyers or renters would need to be subsidised for affordability. And it's showing a fall off in the need for social housing. So I presume it's meaning that some of these people will move into the affordable. So rather than having maybe fully or very substantially subsidised social housing, they'll have partly subsidised affordable housing, and still quite a small percentage meeting their own housing needs. And the reason that it's important to know what's happening at the top of the market is that the smaller the top of the market is, the more people are here. And if only a third of people are meeting their own needs and often stretching themselves to meet their own needs, 2/3 are going to be left with what's left. So I suppose what I think where we've gone wrong probably is that we have pursued policies that are to do with squeezing the standards in housing. We've had a huge amount of deregulation in housing standards. It's been incredibly retrograde. I think the sharp end of it people understand is the co-living, which has now been partially banned or made more difficult. But what we've seen is we've got co-living by the back door with thousands of units now that were built as high-end student housing that don't have a market as high-end student housing. And the risk is that that will be converted into permanent long-term housing. There is nothing wrong with housing somebody permanently in a small space. The problem is if you have hundreds of people in the same building who are all the same demographic, all living in very close proximity, all with very little privacy, issues of noise, issues of public health and disease, and all of those people trapped in a lifestyle where they are unable to form relationships, unable to have people around for their birthday or for Christmas dinner, and it is meeting a tiny amount of their human need in terms of space and security in their and privacy in their home, and that we have effectively built in low standards that impact on people's health and well-being and their ability to advance in life, rather than build in a solid infrastructure that enables people to live independently and to move on with their lives. So looking back at the Dublin City numbers for 2023, as I said, 2/3 subsidised and a third unaffordable. And it doesn't look like there is any intention of increasing capacity. And by that, I mean enabling new players to come into the market, removing barriers so we get real competition. And that's something that the EU Commission raised concerns about last year, is lack of competition in Dublin. And we can see that in the expectations of developers. It does not cost 450,000 to build an apartment in Dublin, or rather it doesn't have to cost 450,000 to build an apartment in Dublin. If we can design buildings that are at appropriate density, they're cheaper to build than buildings at ultra high density, which is what we have been designing with the SHDs. Moderate density can be phased easily and is cheaper to construct and cheaper to maintain over time. It's also more sustainable and more livable. And so if we start with design and then we move into procurement with a wider, more open market, more opportunities for people to get involved in this sector by removing barriers of access to land and money. We can expand the sector and have true competition and start to build from the bottom up. And that's where we'll get affordability and quality, is if there's proper competition in the market. And just closing points then, as I said, co-living has been really retrograde. The idea that co-living is a lifestyle choice for people who are short-term high earners in Dublin for 3, 6, 12 months is an attractive option for some people as a sort of a part hotel with a social life, and is workable for that demographic. But we don't have that many people in that demographic. It's a niche market. And building thousands of units for a niche market means that they will find a use for something else. And the danger is now that the use they will find is not a sustainable use or a livable use as permanent housing. And then the second danger is that it'll eventually start to be rented in order to get tenants. It'll become cheaper and the buildings won't be maintained, and we're building a longer term problem. So I think there are structural issues there in a lot of the deregulation around standards. I'm just going to finish with this image from Corbin Walker, who did an art installation for Dublin City Council this summer, tracking the reduction in standards in Dublin over the last 100 years, which has been really shocking because we saw that all of the gains made by the planners and the City Council from the mid-90s, when we were building very small apartments, and small apartments generally end up being for people who have less money or for living overcrowding, because people who have money don't want small apartments. They will use their spending power in the commuter belt and they'll go further out, and they're not. So we get problems when you don't provide decent housing. So all of the gains that Dublin City Council made in those 20 years in terms of apartment standards were reversed very, very quickly in a short number of years, back into the tiny minimum 12 square metre spaces that we see now. And the schemes we see proposed now, at least 2 of the new very dense, larger schemes proposed in Dublin have 70% of the homes for the studio or 1-bedroom apartments. That's not building a sustainable city. Almost half of our homes in the country have children, and what that is doing is it's making a city of people who are of particular demographics and probably transient and probably more likely to be poor, and it is pushing people who have the means to support the city centre and make a more vibrant mixed community. It's pushing them out. So in conclusion, this is a quote from Michael Sorkin, who says that the idea that there's a renter tenant who much ever trim their space to their demographic is truly invidious. Again, this false narrative about supply has brought in this false narrative about space. There is no such thing as an optimum or minimum house for people. In fact, our minimum standards are too small for most people. They don't account for disability, for a social life, for the needs of families, for working from home. And the minimum size, the idea that everybody would be forced into a minimum size that is suboptimal, is not where we should be moving. It isn't space that's expensive that is making housing unaffordable. It is the speculative market that is making housing unaffordable and the lack of competition in it. So thank you, that's just a brief run through.
Well, I really appreciate that. I'm going to invite Lorcan and Mel to come back in as well, and we can take Q&A. So I think there's a Q&A and a chat box, and if people want to put their questions in there, I think there's a huge amount of information and a huge amount of thought that's gone into it. So I think we can take advantage of that if people, if there's any particular aspect people want to delve into. I suppose there are a number of things that strike me immediately. I suppose one of the things, I think, all of what you finished there about this, the impact that speculation is having on the market has been something that obviously has been talked about for a number of years now. I think probably, but it's always been the case. But I think with NAMA, I think really that kind of, or my sense of it is that really ramped up the potential and impact of that kind of speculation probably happening at the time of the kind of financialization around Europe and the world of housing as well. I suppose to each of the panel, how do we roll back a bit and start to inject affordability given those market forces which are working against it? And it's sort of a side question, because for me, one of the answers to that is the state building and cost rental. And I wonder, Mel, around the thing about the affordability of cost rental, if we also need to think slightly differently about it, and the way that we fund these things is that cost rental, if we look at it over a 25-year mortgage and the costs, they're going to be at the 2000. But if we look at it as long-term investments and start using bonds and sort of way that the state can borrow and spread these things out over, if we need to, over 100 years, you know, would that make the level of difference that would get us down to more affordability, or is that more pie in the sky
I can take that if you like, just launch into that from there. I think you're right. There are other mechanisms, and I know the Green Party would be the first ones to look at the housing agency stuff and say, well, you know, a cost rent should be over 40 years. The thing about that is, as everyone knows, is the longer that your term, the longer the interest rate you're paying, the longer your interest rate danger is. And one of the interesting things that the housing agency report did when they were looking at cost rental, that really in-depth view of it, is that you have an interest rate issue there in the middle of it. I mean, if you take the cost rental example that they have was €357,000 Part 5 unit being purchased in Dublin. And when you put that through the current cost rental process at over 30 years, it's €1,991. Now, if you take a sort of a standard 2% interest rate at the moment, if you or I could buy that unit at 100% mortgage over 30 years, your repayments are €1,319. So straight away you can own that outright in 30 years, and you require a much lower level of subvention. So I suppose the thing about this is you'll get a new unit at the end of it. It's going to be very expensive for the taxpayer, but the two cohorts that lose are, number one, the taxpayer is spending an awful lot more on it, because not only are they buying something that costs an awful lot more over 30 or 40 years to own, but there's a subvention of maybe €800 a month for the duration of that for the tenants to make it affordable. And also the people who are looking to get affordable homes are probably getting around 40% less units for the same money. So why engage in a process that's really expensive when you can do something simpler in a way that delivers more housing for the same budget? So it's trying to do more with the same. I mean, I would concentrate on value for money. And that's even your starting point at €357,000, which is very high. So, and we know that, for example, in 2019, Dunleary Rathdown, their own cost to build a 2-bed apartment, including land, VAT, planning levies, etc., was €294,000. So we know, and also the Society of Chartered Surveyors have gone into this in some detail and said that if the local authorities build on their own land, there are savings there between €140,000 and €160,000 per dwelling. So basically, if your costs are lower, your cost rental is lower. If your costs are high, a lot of people in the private sector would say to you, my rental unit of €2,500 or €3,000 a month is a cost rental because it meets the criteria. That's because the costs are high, the margins are baked into it, and you've really high financing costs. So the state has a way of doing all this stuff at much lower price points, which takes the pressure off the back end. You know, the 2,000 figure per year of affordable housing of cost rental is incredibly low if you think about it. That seems to be where all the demand is. But the state is continually trying to force this square peg through the private sector and outsourcing, and they're ending up with really high prices at the back end of it. So in my head, I would be looking at, there's nothing to stop the state from very easily buying or building out units that they should be renting directly for less than €1,100 at no subvention cost to the state. And it's just a question, how is that organised? Is it a funding issue? Is it on the balance sheet? Is it not? Well, the sort of balance sheet mechanics of that, but you can deliver, absolutely, you can deliver 2-bed apartments in Dublin for less than €300,000 all in. And we should be looking at less than 1,200. So the critical thing is, what's the rental? What's the subvention? Okay, that's the wrong route. Try something else.
Okay. I'm going to invite the others to come in. Lorcan?
Yeah, sure. There's a good question about how you bring affordability, and just I'll link it back to what Mel was saying. There's two kind of ways that I think that we can do it. And number one is back to what Mel was talking about. It's cheaper to build yourself than to kind of do what we've been doing, buying particularly the expensive Part 5s and turnkeys and so on. What people don't realize is that out of, well, people here probably do realize it in fairness, but out of the 20,000 houses that we build every year, only about 7,000 or 8,000 of those come on the market. So that's about 33%. But the state itself is buying up in around 27% of all new houses. So they're a huge player in the market. And the problem is they kind of back themselves into a corner now that what would happen to the market if the state stopped doing that? If it stopped being the kind of purchaser of last, or for in many cases first resort. And that's an expensive way, because if you're buying property from somebody, there's another layer in the process, so therefore there's profit involved. And it typically works out more expensive than building your own, but it also drives prices because the state is kind of competing then with everybody else. And I know AHBs make huge arguments to say it's much more efficient and for them to do that, and I can well understand that, and councils make the same argument. It doesn't make it right, though, that the state is hoovering up brand new houses. So I think the first thing, I think what Mel is talking about has a lot of positive knock-ons if you're sensible about it. The problem, of course, is the inefficiencies for councils, and particularly councils in getting permission to build housing from the department. I think that's always been a problem, and then their own skills, capacity, and will to do it. I mean, the one thing I've learned over the years with dealing with councils is that some are great and some are not. And a lot of it comes from I think the culture comes at the top. The second point about affordability, I suppose, is that there's a huge link between planning policy and the cost of housing. And what has been happening over the years, particularly since 2014, 2015, is that we have the development industry broadly, essentially their lobbyists, going into departments saying, we can't afford to build at current prices, so therefore will you reduce planning standards? And then we can build more units, and therefore the price will come down, be more affordable, and people will be able to afford to buy our units. Of course, anybody who's involved in development knows it's the exact opposite. If you allow people to build more units on the same site because you've reduced the size of them, as in build to rent, or you've created things like co-living, what that does is it drives the price. It doesn't reduce the price. It makes the land more expensive. And we've got into a situation now where we've created so many new housing typologies, student housing, co-living, built to rent, that land has got very expensive. And also add into that then the density requirements, the increased density requirements. So, there are minimum density requirements now before you'll ever get planning permission, and that just increases the price of land, add on construction costs and profit. And out the other end is very expensive housing that in many cases, particularly with apartments, the only potential purchaser out there are the institutional funds, which is why you see thousands and thousands and thousands of apartments being bought up by Greystar and Hines, Kensington, Wilson, and all that kind of stuff, because they don't need to go to a bank to borrow money, whereas your average builder, if they wanted to build that, would have to go and get funding from Bank of Ireland or Ulster Bank or mezzanine funding, which is probably not very successful. So there's a huge link between planning policy and that price or the cost of a house at the other end. And I think we've overdone it. We're going to end up in a situation now, particularly around density. This is why we see all these huge SHD, apartment blocks coming up for planning permission and invariably getting granted planning permission from Burpinala. We're going to end up in a situation soon that we're going to be subsidizing everybody who wants to buy a house or an apartment in an urban area, and we're going to be subsidizing anybody who wants to build a house in a rural area. And that's just expensive. It's kind of bonkers in a way. With the density requirements in particular, have made sites that should be, affordable in locations, particularly regional towns, now unaffordable, and nothing will happen there unless there's a subsidy. So I think we need to start looking at our planning regulations as well, to see how they can be tweaked, so that we can, you don't have to have high density there's very many ways. Of the architects, the two architects with us here, who can tell us all about how you can achieve the same number of houses without going high, for example, which is another driver of construction costs. So it can be done, and I think we should probably decouple some of the planning policies from, the development industry is not going to like that, but anybody who's looking for a house that's slightly more affordable than it is at the moment would probably appreciate it.
Well, do you want to come in? Just if I could hold you to 2 minutes, because I have another question I want to ask. So.
Yeah, I mean, what to say? It is possible to solve this problem. It is eminently solvable, but we have to decide what success is. You know, to my mind, it would be that the vast majority of people can afford their own housing from their own means, which is where we probably were a long time ago. Even with speculation in the market, we had 70% of people being able to buy their own home. We're now looking at a situation in Dublin where it's reversed, where we will have maybe 30% able to afford their own home, and not even all of them buyers. So it's just not a sustainable system to put in that level of public subsidy. So we're, you know, in broad terms, we're sort of at the £500,000 home in Dublin, where most people can only afford £250,000, or a lot of people. And the level of subsidy therefore required to fill that gap is so great that the vast majority of people will not have their needs met. It really comes down to I mean, some of it is procurement, like Mel was saying about turnkeys. It's not the best way of doing things. Yes, in less expensive locations, it can be a quick fix and it can support the local development market, but certainly not in high value locations like Dublin City. And we've created all sorts of barriers in our procurement system that make public procurement too expensive and too limited in who can take part. And that needs to shake up. And as Lorcan said, we've been sold on this idea of, you know, unless we build high-rise dense apartments in Dublin, we will have unsustainable commuter sprawl. Neither of them are sustainable. What is sustainable is what we have in some locations already, which is mid-rise terraced housing and apartments at 4, 5, 6 floors that can be built in phases, that is cost optimal in terms of construction and maintenance, that is very livable in this climate, that is decent size for families, and that sets a market level where a family size apartment costs what a family can afford, and therefore a fraction of that costs what somebody who can't afford a lot can afford. But what we've done at the moment is we've made every room £1,000 a month effectively. That's what the Dublin market is. So whether you're a half single tenant and you end up in co-living at £1,000 a month, or whether you're a family trying to squeeze into a one bed at £2,000 or close to it a month, we've created a market where that's what a room is, and that's just totally unsustainable.
So I suppose from the Simon community's perspective, I mean, given the people that we work with, one of the important questions for us is in terms of the ambition in housing for all. If we pull it back from the market and back down to local authorities, I suppose we've maybe 2 minutes left, so I'll just kind of a quick sort of answer to this or thought on this is, do we think that the local authorities, if they were to pull some of the levers that you're talking about, can deliver the 9,500 public homes on public land a year? And if you've looked at the numbers, do you think that's enough? And I'll go in order of my speakers. So Lorcan, I'll drop that to you first.
Thank you very much. That's a very slippery ball you've just passed me there. I think a lot of it depends on the local authority involved. I mean, at the back of everything, you're relying on humans. I know we talk about this in terms of policy and numbers and all that, but it's humans who will have to step up and tell someone to do something else, or to apply for funding, or to get out in their car and go and look for sites. And I think when it comes to local authorities, there's, like in society, like in my own department here, like in the Simon community, I'm sure there's, you know, probably not Simon community, but there's variations, there's variables of enthusiasm and willingness to get up and do things. And I think that's very true across councils. We know that various ministers have got very frustrated with different councils over the years. I see it in different areas, not just housing, I see it in other areas that I'm tangentially involved in it as well. So I think whether they can do it will very much depend on the culture in individual councils. And we see this over the years when Mel does a great table every year looking at what councils have, you know, delivered what housing by build or by turnkey, whatever. And you can see the pattern of councils that are doing great work and councils that don't do great work. I think if we take it that they're all enthusiastic and, you know, are going to up the game, like it's a 20-fold increase from what they've been doing for the last 5 years. So for every house that they used to build, they're now going to build 20. I think that's a big ask. I think the labour stuff, in terms of, is there actually labour there too? Because it won't be councils themselves, it won't be council workers who will. who'll be kind of picking up shovels and picks. It'll be subcontracted to somebody else. A lot of construction workers are busy doing something else. They're building hotels, they're building co-living, they're building build to rent, and they could be diverted back to building housing if we went back and looked at the planning stuff that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So I think a lot of it will depend on the individual authorities involved, and then there's capacity, but ultimately it will come from the politicians at the top to decide if they want to kind of facilitate this.
Okay, Mel?
Okay, very briefly, can we reach the targets? No. You know, Orla's target there is 2,120 social homes in Dublin next year. You know, the 4 Dublin local authorities built 1,492 homes in 4.5 years. It's not possible. It's totally unrealistic to do that. Is it enough? No, it's not enough. Absolutely not. Because we know if you look at new household formation, and the growth of HAP is a really good indicator of it. You know, when you look at the net growth of households, it almost matches the increase in HAP. So all the demand is happening where people are falling off the ledge, entering into rental markets which are severely unaffordable. What is also you've got a resource issue there. There isn't enough staff. If we, you know, the 2,700 new building workers who are in the plan that are required to deliver new housing at current household rates will need 10,000 rentals just to house them. So that's an additional demand figure in the rental market. So the answer here is probably going to be the next big story, which is the number of vacant homes that are there. We know the figure that's banding around is from Geodata at 92,000. We know that the Geodata figure is typically around half of what is actually vacant. The CSO's more accurate figure from the last census was 183,000 dwellings. We know that you can do up 4 or 5 vacant homes for the same cost and time and resource level as one new build. So the answer is in vacant homes. And that has been really the key here, is how do you bring on more houses at affordable price points all around the country without blowing the wheels off the rental market and without inflating prices further? Is you concentrate on existing vacant stock. And we know that, for example, in Dublin City, the audit done by Dublin City Council a few years ago is that within the canals, there's enough vacant upper space above shops for 4,000 apartments. So that census figure, the census has been delayed by a year. When the census is done, the big story will be, oh my God, we have 140,000 vacant homes all around the state. So we know also that that census figure doesn't include vacant commercial upper floors. So we have a vast capacity for possible dwellings all around the country that's almost built, well located, serviced, cheap to do, and can be done really quickly. So I think the answer is, can they do it? No. Is it ambitious enough? No, it isn't. But yes, we can do it. And it's the one blank spot that they have in this plan. And it was also a blank spot in the previous plan, was the use of existing vacant properties. They just haven't done it. So that would be my take on it very quickly.
I went in a very different direction than when you started. I have to admit, I thought it was all going to be doom and gloom, but no, I think that's a really welcome intervention. I think definitely the vacancy is going to be coming. Orla, the last word to you before I'm going to hand over to Deirdre.
I'm trying to end on a positive note, Simon Community. Vacancy is absolutely the way that you can solve this problem quickly and make the money stretch as far as possible. You can probably do 4 upper floor refurbishments for 100,000. Sorry, for the cost of building a new house for 250,000, and you can do it to a high standard, and people can live there where they have their own key, their own front door, in a community where they're not stigmatized, where there's a bus stop outside and a shop down the street. And that is integrating people and giving them dignity and privacy in their home. And that is achievable quickly. And there are grants available from Europe for energy efficiency that we can tap into. And that is something that the local authorities could empower and enable very quickly if they were minded to, so that owners of these properties are brought in and handed a list of how to do it, and grants and supports and leases for the next 5 years or whatever else is needed. And it's local employment, and it's vibrancy in towns, and it's homes for people.
That's a brilliant way to end this panel. I want to thank Lorcan, Mel and Orla. And again, a personal thank you for all the contribution that you make to the work assignment and to my work in the policy. I'd be certainly in the housing aspect of it, I'd be absolutely lost with it. So it really is appreciated. And the broader influence you had in, I think, on housing policy has been substantive. So to all 3 of you, I want to say thank you. And with that, we're immediately going to, I'm immediately going to hand over the chair to Deirdre O'Shaughnessy, who from the Irish Examiner, who's graciously agreed to chair our second panel. So Deirdre, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, perfect. I'm delighted to be here this morning. Thank you for inviting me to chair the panel. Very interested in that first panel, particularly that talk vacancy. We've just done a series on that ourselves in the Examiner, and something that gets us very hot under the collar. This next panel, we're going to discuss homelessness measures under Housing for All. I understand that Freck is having a little bit of difficulty joining us, so I'll just go through quickly who our panelists are for this session. Wayne Stanley, who everybody has already met, is the National Spokesperson and Head of Policy and Communications with the Simon Communities of Ireland. He leads on the strategic development of the organisation, working closely with the Board of Directors and the 8 Simon communities to achieve the organisational goal of ending homelessness in Ireland. Wayne joined Simon in 2019, having worked in the homeless and housing sector for 15 years. He's currently chairperson of Home for Good, a broad-based campaign seeking to secure a referendum to enshrine a right to housing in the Constitution. He's also Vice President of FIANSA, European Federation of National Organisation Working with the Homeless, where he works with colleagues to tackle homelessness in Europe. We're also joined this morning by Aoife Kelly-Desmond, who is the Managing Solicitor at Mercy Law Resource Centre, an independent law centre and charity which provides free legal advice and representation to people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless in the areas of public housing and social welfare law. Our third panellist, who I think has just joined us there, is Freck Spinowin. Freck has been the director of FIANSA since 2001. FIANSA, the European Federation of National Organisations Working with Homeless People, is a European network of NGOs working on the issue of homelessness. It has members in 30 European countries, and FIANSA is the only major European network that focuses exclusively on homelessness at European level. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome, Freck. I think Wayne is going to kick off this session with an introduction in relation to this topic from Simon. Wayne.
Thank you, Deirdre. That was, given that you've just landed in, that's excellent, Chair, so much appreciated. And just to say, Freck is has been trapped on a train, which is why he's wearing a mask, and hopefully it'll all work out. But he's graciously agreed to try and work with us, but we'll see how we go. So I suppose to set the scene for this panel a bit, we in the Simon community obviously contributed to what we want to see in a homeless action plan, and in Housing for All in particular. The first panel there was looking at housing because a home is the answer to homelessness, and that's very clear. But I suppose there's also a discrete section, particularly in the plan, which is, as the Minister said earlier, has 18 discrete actions on homelessness. I won't go through them all because that would take far more than my allotted 7 or 8 minutes. But I think what we do want to say is there's an awful lot to welcome in this plan, and there needs to be. I think while it's really welcome that the previous panel ended on that positive note that there are answers, I think clearly at 10,000 units of public housing on public land, that the plan itself is actually ambitious based on what's possible. But when we look at the numbers and we look at the number of people coming in to the social housing list every year, and we look at the need to kind of draw down people out of the HAP system and provide more security of public housing, because it's those people who are most at risk of homelessness, as people in the private rental sector, as we know. So to do that, we think there probably needs to be about 15,000 public homes built every year and allocated. So how do we bridge that gap between what's possible and what's needed to address homelessness? Because it is when you have that absence of supply and you have a market where rents are increasing and unaffordable, it is the most vulnerable who and often the most disenfranchised who end up in our homeless system. So how do we prevent that? And the answer is in the homeless strategy is a way of bridging that gap, and hopefully as we move forward we will start to see supply come online. And if we can start now to drive down the curve, we can, yeah, we think the target in Housing for All of eradicating homelessness or eliminating homelessness by 2030, if we were to start now and get ahead of the curve now, all of a sudden 2030 looks like something that's achievable. If we're, as we've seen over the last quarter, we're going to see continued increases for the next couple of years, I think 2030 won't be possible. So how do we start getting ahead now? Well, the first thing we can do is we can take inspiration from the last 18 months. Prior to the last 3 months, we saw a pretty much steady decline in the number of people in homelessness. The minister referenced that in his opening comments as well. And what we're looking at the inspiration of that. And the reason why that happened is because we had a moratorium on evictions and a moratorium on rent increases. What that tells us is something that the sector has been saying for a long time, and something the government has known and has attempted to build into a lot of its strategies, has been prevention. If we can stop people from having to cross the threshold of the homeless services, logically, we see less homelessness. And it also gives us more capacity to support people who maybe need additional supports and to move people on all the more quickly and put our resources into move on of the most one. What that looks like in terms of Housing for All is there's a very firm commitment to it. There's a very firm commitment to the 2030 target, which is very welcome. And the reason why we've invited Freck here today is because the talk about the prevention is informed in part from some of the work in the Lisbon Declaration, which the government signed up to, which also had the 2030 strategy. What in the 18 actions that are set out in the strategy, though, there isn't one that's specifically around preventing homelessness in the first instance. And that's why, sort of, as we're launching Simon, we're also launching a campaign around seeking an amendment to the Residential Tenancies Act, which would ensure that if people are at risk, deemed by their local authority to be at risk of homelessness, they get an extension of their notice to quit for 12 weeks, while the local authority and NGOs like Simon work with them to prevent them having to cross the threshold of a homeless service. That's the kind of direct preventative action that we think is needed, particularly now as we go forward. It's far from pie in the sky. If we look at, we have the best data we have is from the Dublin region, and they're currently preventing between 55 and 60% of all the families who present to Dublin in the Dublin region are prevented from going into homelessness and diverted into a new tenancy. If we can get that up to 70 or 80% and maintain the good practice and build on the good practice as set out in the Housing for All, and we look at the way we allocate the resources of public housing and the sort of enhancing the homeless hat around the country, I think we can now reverse that trend of the last 3 months and start to see homeless figures start to go down again. So that's our big call out of it. I mean, the minister's right. We should draw inspiration from what happened over the previous 18 months, even the previous 2 years. But we also need to use that as learning for how we carry on, because a fall from 10,000 to 8,000 is very welcome, but 8,000 people in homelessness just isn't good enough, and we need to be doing better and pushing on.
Thanks, Wayne. That's some very interesting points there, and I suppose it's a positive that there has been progress, but as you say, it's all about keeping the momentum moving. I'm going to leave Freck to last, just so his train situation might get resolved, hopefully. Fair play to Freck. And I'm going to go to Aoife Kelly Desmond next. Aoife, if you want to get going there, welcome and good morning.
Thanks, Deirdre. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is one of the maybe principled points out of the Housing for All strategy, which is the commitment around holding a referendum on housing. And that would be, an essential next step for us to look at having a right to housing added to the Constitution. And, looking at the context of this panel and on the goal to eliminate homelessness by 2030, recognising that right is the really essential groundwork for that aim to be achievable and to be something that is not just met, but that continues. So what I was going to talk about a bit this morning was, firstly, why is a right to housing something that we need to recognise, and how does our constitution currently have an imbalance in the way that it deals with property rights and housing rights? Also, what the outcome of a referendum on a right to housing might look like, and what recognising that right to housing could mean for us as a society and for dealing with the housing crisis. So this is just to start first with the, why do we need to recognise a right to housing? This is an issue that individuals and organisations have been campaigning for many years, calling on the government to hold a referendum on a right to housing, including the Home for Good coalition that Deirdre mentioned earlier. The Simon community are part of, Mercy Law are a member of it as well, and a lot of other individuals and organisations. And it's a very welcome progress that the Housing for All strategy is now committing to hold a referendum on housing. But there's a lot of detail, I suppose, yet to be worked out on what that's going to mean. And from my perspective, working in Mercy Law, as Deirdre mentioned, we're an independent law centre that gives free legal advice and representation to people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. But in simple terms, what we do is we use the law to try and alleviate the burden of homelessness. So in the course of that work, we obviously see many things about our current laws and practices that detrimentally impact people who are dealing with the housing crisis. But probably the single most fundamental gap is the gap in a firm protection and recognition of a right to housing in Ireland. So that's why we would see a very urgent need to amend the constitution to close that gap and to expressly recognise that adequate housing is something that should be a right. As I mentioned, Housing for All recognises that a referendum for housing will be held. However, the devil's in the detail on this. At the moment, it doesn't even recognise a referendum on a right to housing. It just says on housing. So it's very unclear yet what that's even going to mean. It could mean, as I would hope it would mean, and those of us in Housing for All, Home for Good, and others who've been advocating for this, that it would mean a referendum on inserting a standalone, clear and explicit right to housing into the constitution. But it could also mean something at more tweaking around the edges of existing rights in the constitution, which would, at least in my own view, not go far enough. The detail of what that referendum is going to look like is something that will be worked out in the Commission on Housing that Housing for All has also committed to establishing to look at the referendum issue and other proposals as well. So I suppose maybe just to take a little bit of a step back on what would a right to housing look like. If you step away from the very legal question of what's a right to housing in black and white, ultimately housing is a very basic human need. And we would say, and you would hope most in society would agree, that having a home is very central to the dignity of people, and it's a foundation for your life. And without a home or a place to lay your head at night, you can't meaningfully participate in society. And ultimately, at a basic level, acknowledging a right to housing is just acknowledging that as a society, we believe that everyone has the right to have the ability to meet that very fundamental and basic need. And some people might think that surely that's already something that we have, but unfortunately it isn't. And expressly recognising that right is really needed, because as things stand today, the Constitution is very fundamentally unbalanced in the way it approaches this. And it has some very clear and express provisions protecting private property rights under Article 43 and Article 40.3, but it doesn't have any equivalent clear recognition of a right to housing or to a home. And this isn't just a semantic issue, because what it means is that the starting point of any legal analysis that the government are undertaking or others around regulating land or making housing policy that in any way touches on privately owned property, it starts from the perspective of the rights of the property owner and not from the perspective of society as a whole. Now, the Constitution does allow for the right to private property to be restricted in the interest of what's called the common good, but it's still an examination that starts from looking at the private interest and then looking at the common good only if it's something that's specifically relevant to the state trying to interfere with it. And that's a very complex analysis, and it's not something that really enables the easy making of nuanced or quickly changeable or adaptable housing policy. Rebalancing the Constitution to recognise a parallel right to housing would have a number of benefits. There's the more legal and firm benefits I'll talk about in a minute, but was at a very basic level, the Constitution recognises what we as society see as our fundamental values and our laws. So there's a huge symbolic value in terms of what our priorities are as a society to rebalancing the Constitution to reflect these different interests that we have in society. But in a more real and practical sense, it would have a real impact on the state's approach to tackling the housing crisis and to housing policy. If you look at Housing for All, the referendum commitment it's in the first steps in the strategy. It's in how you establish a sustainable housing system. And that's reflective of the reality that policymakers over the years have repeatedly ruled out making progressive housing policies on the grounds that the constitutional protections around private property are a real barrier to the state making interventions. Now, that's a position that's often based on a very restrictive legal analysis of what the common good means and how it interacts with Article 43 of the Constitution. And not everyone agrees that that analysis is correct, but regardless of the sort of academic legal arguments around that, in practical terms, it's very clear that in reality, this imbalance between an express right and what is currently not there expressly, in practice does operate as a constraint in the government being more creative or more flexible or more bold in their housing policy. So then what could a right to housing look like? As I mentioned at the start, Housing for All isn't it's not a detailed strategy, as we all know on some of these more principled points. It doesn't go into detail on what the referendum would look like. But in an ideal world, the view that we would have at Mercy Law, and that's shared with a lot of others, including the Home for Good Coalition, is that a more flexible approach would be to rebalance the Constitution by leaving the existing private property rights where they are, but adding in a coexisting right to housing that then gets weighed and balanced against the other rights in the Constitution. And that could be done by adding a new Article 43A to the Constitution that would set out a very clear and directly enforceable standalone right to access adequate housing, and also a statement on the state's obligations to realise that right within the available resources that it has. The proposal to come at it in this way would be aimed at trying to move away from the overly narrow interpretation of private property rights as the starting point for any housing policy, and it would hope to give the government more flexibility to respond to the housing crisis, and also into the future ensure that there's a basic standard that needs to be met. In this scenario, what would happen is the government, the legislature, and the courts would all be tasked with balancing these rights against each other, taking a proportional and rational approach rather than solely focusing on one over the other. So aside from the more legal question around balance, it's also something that would reframe the state's role in housing and take it from a position we have now where the primary role is to protect private home ownership and private property ownership, and expand it to a role that also is responsible for protecting our basic human needs to have safe and secure housing in society. So I've spoken quite a bit about what the right to housing is. I think this is an issue, as with any constitutional change, where people will often have concerns about what does it really mean and what could it lead to. So I just want to talk a little bit briefly about what a right to housing in the Constitution is not or would not be. I suppose the proposal for a referendum on the right to housing was something that was in the media a little bit earlier in the summer, because there was a proposal in the Seanad about bringing a referendum on this. And for anyone who listened to some of the commentary around it, you would have seen that the first question that was asked by a few presenters and commentators was, well, does this not just mean everybody gets a free house? And apart from being a very simplistic approach, it's also just absolutely not the case. Constitutional rights are not prescriptive, detailed things that force government to undertake specific policies or actions. They're high-level statements of principle and basic law. And this amendment, or any constitutional amendment, wouldn't force the government to execute it in a particular way. It wouldn't mean a right to a key to a house for everyone, or a right to have a specific house in a specific place. But it would mean having a basic floor of legal protection that the government has to meet in any of its policies around housing. And this was something that the first panel touched on quite a bit, and it's relevant here as well, is that the right to housing it's not just about social housing or about the government directly providing housing. The right to housing would touch on all aspects of the state's housing policy and its economic policies that deal with housing. And because it's relevant to all of the issues that the earlier panelists discussed around affordability of home ownership for ordinary people to buy or rent, the availability of appropriate types of housing stock in the right places, security of tenure for renters, and things like, as Wayne spoke about, around the Residential Tenancies Act and things like that. So it would be a very basic, wide-ranging right that would benefit, and apply to every person in society, no matter where they stand in the kind of messy world of housing. For people who own their own houses, they would have increased rights around that, because they would also have a right to housing as well as their existing property rights. So the right to housing is an expansive recognition of a basic right that you would hope everyone in society has, and it would set a baseline that the government would also have to factor into the future. And ultimately, recognising this right would be a very strong positive step around reflecting our society's values. And it would also be part of building and enduring future protections so that our housing system doesn't just stabilise in the near term and, you know, resolve the housing crisis we have now and the numbers of people we still have in homelessness, but that it would ensure that this is something that throughout the future of our society is built in to every decision the government make around housing. So I might leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Aoife. That's a very interesting summary of the issues. Freck, I'm going to try you and see how your audio is and if we can hear you great, but I'm not sure where you are at the moment, if you're still on the train or not. Good morning, Freck. No, I don't think that's going to work for us. Right, so what I might do is we'll open up maybe to Q&A if people are interested in asking some questions at this point. I'm sure that what Aoife has said there in relation to the right to housing potentially becoming enshrined in the Constitution will raise some questions for people who are watching this morning. Certainly I have plenty of questions myself. Aoife, in terms of for something like that to actually get off the ground, you know, we're looking at sort of years and years of law reform commission reports and proposals and plans. If the government decided in the morning that they were going to introduce this, how long would it actually take?
Well, I suppose it's something that at this point we'd hope is more advanced, and the recognition that there is going to be a referendum on housing at least would mean it would be something you'd hope could be achieved in the next 12 to 18 months, and ultimately with referenda, they takes a very long time often to get to the point of calling it, but once it's actually called, a lot of the groundwork has already been done and a lot of the thinking has already been done on, what a right to housing could look like and on the various legal complexities around how you fit that into the Constitution. So it's something we would hope could be done actually in a relatively quick time frame. That's partially dependent, I think, on the Commission for Housing as well. That the government's made clear that that's how they want to start looking at this issue. So if that's something that's up and running relatively soon, and runs for a few months, you'd hope that it could be a more near-term time frame than maybe even, I think, 6 months or 12 months ago we might have thought was possible.
One of the other things you mentioned that I thought was quite interesting was that it would potentially improve, I suppose, maybe the security of people who own their own homes. Would that be with regard to things like bank forced evictions, or what sort of areas would that have an implication in?
Yeah, so I suppose the idea with a right to housing is that, as I said, it reflects a right that everybody has. And if somebody currently owns a property in Ireland, they already have quite a high degree of protection in their own home around private property ownership rights and their rights to inviolability of the dwelling. But I suppose this would add a further hard constitutional layer on the fact that this is someone's home and where they live is something that additionally needs more protection. So, it's something that enhances the protection for everyone in the context of their home, whether they're private homeowners or not. As it stands, far and away, private home owners have the most protection, and those who don't own their homes, or particularly people who are reliant on government provided housing or subsidised housing, have the least protection. And this is to bring everybody up rather than reduce anybody's rights, I think is the way it would be.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. Wayne, I just might come to you next. Just in relation to Fianza, I suppose, and what's happening across the different European bodies that are the different bodies across Europe that are working on this. Is there kind of a momentum across Europe, or are the situations vastly different?
I see. Frank, I'm not sure if Frank is going to work, but okay, I was actually on the steering committee with Frank around the development of the Lisbon Declaration. So I think what's been interesting for us is, I suppose, when the idea of a 2030 target was started, we were concerned that that level of ambition would scare the horses. So with a declaration like this, there was an agreement that the Commission would go forward with it, particularly the Commissioner Schmidt, under whose commission it sits. He was very committed to it. and he drove it forward. So it was something was going to happen. And there was kind of an agreement that if they could get 16 countries involved, so if they could get more than half, that they would continue with it. And certainly what was interesting was it was the countries where there's the most momentum and the most developed homeless strategies who were most enthused by the idea. And then they came with looking at a target, and they came with 2030. So the concern was, as I say, that would scare the horses. What happened was all the member states signed up to it. So I have a real sense that the Lisbon Declaration is a moment that we shouldn't lose sight of. The plan now will be for what the Lisbon Declaration also did was set up a platform which is going to bring together all the actors across Europe. And that creates a space for the kind of cross-pollination of ideas around things like prevention, housing first, and how they're going to work. So it takes it slightly. What I think is interesting about it is, like, there will be government representatives on it. So it will be, people from local authorities. It will be people from the Department of Housing. And I think it creates an interesting space kind of out of the cauldron of, in the Irish context, where housing is such a hot topic. And it'll hopefully unpeel some of the politics around it and actually give them the opportunity to really engage with solutions in a cross-pollinating way. Because we know, and everyone uses this example, but in Helsinki, they've made huge strides in addressing homelessness. They're at what they don't like us to call, but what we constantly call functional zero. In Helsinki, I think there's one homeless hostel and it houses 54 people. So while our homeless figures are what they are, if the way we count in Helsinki, it would be 54, which is staggering. Now, they've done that by a commitment to housing first and a commitment to providing the housing for people at risk of homelessness. So there are very clear strategies there. So I think in the European context, there absolutely is a real momentum there now that we should be a part of and hopefully drive forward with. I mean, Aoife, if I could just make one comment about one of the things that Aoife said that I had wanted to say as well is that the Housing for All, there's some really welcome aspects of it. But one of the things that, as Aoife rightly says, is it's not yet a fully formed strategy to address homelessness. And that's why I think for this year, we're focusing on the prevention element, because we feel that's a sort of an area that's not fully explored within the Housing for All strategy, within the Housing for All plan. But I think the other thing, there's a Action 3.8, which we'll be watching closely, and that's where the department has committed to issuing guidance to local authorities to ensure that Housing for All is taken account of in their homeless action plans. If that missive, or whatever form it takes, is a sort of a real drive to provide resources, to setting targets, to supporting local authorities, to really drive Housing for All and drive down homelessness, sort of supported by national legislation like the Simon Bill that we're promoting, or some variation of it, then I think we're in an exciting space. If it's sort of please be conscious of Housing for All, I think we're probably not on the path that both Aoife and I and Frank would hope we were on.
Thanks, Wayne, for that. In terms, then, I suppose of well, I'm going to ask you for the European angle, seeing as I think Frank is still a little bit out of the picture at the moment. In terms, I suppose, you mentioned Helsinki, and I was actually going to ask you about Finland, because obviously we've heard so much about their housing first policy over the years. I saw something this morning that Berlin had voted to, I think people in Berlin had voted to seize privately held accommodation from landlords, which I can't ever imagine that happening here, but you never know if we get that right into the constitution, who knows what might happen. Like, the situations are so vastly different and the legal systems are so vastly different across European countries that the colleagues that you're working with, I mean, in some respects, is it very difficult to come up with any kind of common goals or common policy? Obviously, ending homelessness is the goal, but how to get there must be very, very different across the different countries.
They all have very different housing systems. They all have very different ways of approaching housing. I mean, when we were talking about cost rental earlier, Melvin, obviously that's huge in Austria and Vienna. It's widespread throughout Europe, but I think that, again, where everybody goes is Austria, Vienna. to answer your question, yes, I think when it comes to homelessness, we can see a lot of consolidation. Because what we need to do is we need to think differently about homelessness. It's not at the extremes, it's not a failing of the person. It's not addiction or mental health that causes homelessness. Absolutely, those things contribute to it. And there are a number of very positive actions in Housing for All around supporting people with addiction and mental health. And those actions will support people out of homelessness, and they will save lives. And they're really, really welcome. But when we look at why people come into homelessness, there are far more people with mental health difficulties than there are people in homelessness. There are far more people who suffer with addiction than there are people in homelessness. Homelessness is much more complex. At one level, and at another level, it's really whether the person has or the household has the social or economic capital to be able to provide themselves a home. And when you get back to that space, regardless of your housing system, and when you look at the total number of people experiencing homelessness and the resources that we have, absolutely, you'll need to tweak your plans, but every country, we believe, can work towards ending homelessness. And there's a lot of synergy there in terms of things like Housing First, which works. And what we need to do is that conversion that happens when people see it work. I had my road to Damascus moment 15 years ago when we supported somebody into a home, and everyone was convinced that it wouldn't work because it was really chaotic. It was, this archetypal, it'll never work, then it supports and whatever. And within 3 months, he had completely turned his life around because he got that stability of a home. Now, not every case is like that. Supports are needed. You have to have it. It's not just housing, it's housing with the required supports. But it is transformative.
In terms then of the numbers, Wayne, across Europe, like where do we stack up in comparison with other European countries? Sorry, you're on mute.
One of the issues we have, and actually it's one of the first actions we hope to see out of the European framework, is that it's very hard to compare. So if you go to Helsinki and ask them nationally what are your homeless figures, they come up with a figure of, I think, around 8,000, right? Not there yet, which is similar to ours. But if they counted the way we count, we'd be into double digits. And that's one of the issues around Europe, is that we all count in different ways. In some, the reason why in Helsinki, what they look at is people in housing exclusion who don't get onto our official count. So people in overcrowded situations who are, to all intents and purposes, well, they don't have a stable home, and they would start to use those kind of definitions. There are some areas where they have huge numbers, but literally they're probably only counting rough sleeping. A little bit more.
And if I can add something very quickly, I don't know if you hear me, and sorry about all the troubles, but I think there is many countries in the European Union that face exactly similar challenges as Ireland. You don't hear me? Okay, I will leave it. It's probably too difficult.
We can't hear you, Frank.
No, we can, Frank. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. You can. Sorry about how. No, I think there is sufficient countries that are facing exactly the same challenges as Ireland is facing. The scaling up of housing first, housing-led approaches, introducing more targeted and effective prevention, etc. Like the impact of migration. All these things are quite similar in a whole range of countries. So the potential to learn is quite big. Still, even if we cannot transpose literally what's happening in other countries to the Irish context, we always have to adapt it, be a little bit creative. But I think the difference should not stand in the way of effective European cooperation. And the fact that we have that now formally organized with 27 member states being part of that will come with a whole range of opportunities. And there's not only the learning that is an opportunity, there might be European funding that will be made available, there might be the opportunity to pool research questions and do European research, there might actually be legislative initiatives that are possible at European level. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the potential of this Lisbon Declaration and the launch of this European platform for combating homelessness.
That's really interesting, Frank. I'm glad we got something from you, because that's a fascinating idea that you could be tapping into a whole other pool of, I suppose, of assistance. Is there any suggestion of potentially streamlining how the counting is done across European countries? I mean, I don't even know if all the local authorities in Ireland count in the same way, so maybe that is a bit ambitious.
No, it's not. It's not ambitious. There is already the ambition to do a big initiative at European level in relation to counting. At the moment, the European Union is already counting past experiences of homelessness amongst the population. But I don't think that we should be too pessimistic. I'm hopeful that there will be some kind of a useful initiative in relation to statistics data collection at European level.
That's very interesting. Freck, in terms of what Aoife was saying about enshrining, I don't know if you could hear everything, but potentially enshrining a right to housing in the Irish Constitution. From your knowledge of other countries that you work with, would that be something that is a baseline in a lot of countries that already exists, or kind of where do we sit in terms of that?
I would be lying if I said that there is a European country that has the enforceable, opposable right to housing working in the details. But the countries that we often refer to as examples are countries like France, to some extent, has managed that. Countries like Scotland, for instance, are making quite a bit of progress there. Also, countries like Finland, even if they don't have it enforceable as a right to housing, there is really quite a bit of progress there. But I think maybe even more important than the examples of other countries are the international human rights treaties that are insufficiently used to litigate also in different countries, and that can help to create a momentum to advance the right to housing in the different countries. I'm thinking about the European Social Charter, the revised European Social Charter of the Council of Europe. I'm also thinking about a number of treaties at UN level. I think as NGOs, we look too little at them and we don't use them sufficiently to actually engage in strategic litigation.
That's a very interesting point, Freck. Aoife, is that something that that you've come across in your work? Is that something that's ever used in Ireland?
Yeah, so I suppose that there's, I was actually struggling to hear Freck on my line. Sorry, it might have just been my line. I struggled to catch exactly what he said.
Yeah, in relation to, he mentioned that the international human rights treaties are insufficiently used to litigate across Europe, so that there would be similar rights in some of those. I think he particularly mentioned some of the UN treaties, and there was another one which I didn't catch. But is that something that has ever come through the Irish courts, or is it an option? Yeah,
so I mean, we would quite often in our own work, refer to European international human rights charters, like the European Convention on Human Rights, things like the right to family life and things like that, when advocating for people, and particularly for families that are being separated in homeless accommodation, which is a big issue we deal with quite a lot. So those are rights that we would deal with, but they're not that easy to enforce. And I suppose partially with the right to housing, even though the Irish government have to comply with the European Charter for Human Rights, our constitution is the starting point in Ireland, and particularly for setting policy. And at the moment, I would say the European rights are not quite formulated in a way that would completely override, for example, the lack of that right in the Irish constitution. So, I mean, they are things that we use, but they're not as easy to rely on in terms of hard litigation as you might like them to be. I mean, I do think that there's definitely quite a good point in what Frigg is saying, that it's not something that's probably used as much as it could be, but I think it's not, it's something that would be easier to complement if we had a right to housing under our own constitution as well, rather than something that would replace it, I think.
Yeah, fair point. Freck, I just want to come back to you. Seeing as we didn't get your full talk at the very beginning, is there anything else you'd like to add? If you're still there. No, I don't think so. We've lost him, but look, we got some of the good stuff while the going was good. There is a chat box here available if anybody would like to contribute questions, or anybody has a comment that they would like to put to any of our speakers. I don't see any questions coming in, so you've obviously all covered everything very comprehensively. So Wayne, I might just hand back to you. I know you want to speak about the pre-budget submission. Thank
you, Deirdre. Thanks for that, chairing me. I'm always forget, because I tend to end up chairing these, particularly the smaller ones, but it's always really useful to have the insight, particularly of a journalist or an editor who can unpick the points that I think people will find really interesting. So it's a real treat to have you chairing. So thank you, and thank you for chairing so ably. Yeah, I think a follow on from Aoife. I mean, I think again, what we're hoping to see is that the driving of the what's in Housing for All needs to be driven forward in a very constructed and sort of plan that will see us move towards the 2030 target. I think that plan needs to include the right to housing, as Aoife outlined, and I know as part of Home for Good, but more generally, Mercy Law have been at the forefront of the work of showing the need for and constructively showing how we can implement the right to housing. And I think one of the examples that's always given is the fact that we have a right to education. And while that right to education doesn't guarantee everyone a school at the end of their street of the denomination of where they like and the level of, you know, it's not a house for everyone. It's a commitment that the state has made to education, and where there are the most egregious failings of the state when it comes to children's education, it has been that constitutional amendment that has ensured that our children have, you know, our government is pushed to ensure that our children get that basic human right of education. And that's how we see a right to housing in our constitution having an impact, is that it will have that impact on the most egregious cases, but and then that will have a flow into how we generally view housing. Following on from that, as Deirdre mentioned, I wanted to mention two things. One, we've our pre-budget submission, and to some degree it's been surpassed by Housing for All, because obviously we do the work around pre-budget submission in advance of Housing for All. So there's a number of positive things that we're already anticipating, which is the allocation to local authorities when it comes to their housing, the allocation to local authorities in terms of supporting homeless services. What we are hoping as well is that provision will be put in place to protect people. So social welfare rates will need to be looked at. HAP rates will need to be reviewed, because while we cannot continue to chase the private rental market through the HAP system, that doesn't help anybody. But in the immediate term, we need to ensure that local authorities have the resources to get people out of homelessness in sustainable ways, rather than the topping up that we all see happening every week. And I know Aoife will be seeing that as well, of people under pressure because they've been forced into essentially unsustainable situations. The final thing is that bill that I keep referring to is something that we have worked with a barrister to develop, and with providing that extra level of protection, which I think is really important. If this plan is going to work, prevention will be one of the keys, if not the key thing that's going to drive it forward. So the last call would be to ask everyone, if you can go to simon.ie, I think the link will go up in the chat there as well, and sign a letter to your local TD and to the minister, asking for him to give consideration to the Simon bill. That would be very welcome. And we genuinely believe that if such a bill was introduced with the resources behind it in the local authorities, we could push that 55 to 60% of people who are prevented from entering homelessness up to 70 or 80%. And if we can do that, that gives us a real grounding to move that dial downwards and really push on towards the 2030 target. And the 2030 target, that I should say, we acknowledge is ambitious, and we acknowledge that the minister in particular probably spent a significant amount of political capital getting it over the line. So today, hopefully, in the broadest context, has been a positive day. I think closing on while there are a number of challenges for Housing for All, there are also a number of opportunities when it comes to vacancy. And certainly there's a great opportunity when it comes to the homeless section of it, if we get our strategy right, and prevent people from coming into homelessness, support those who are the most vulnerable with the supports they need to find a home and move on from a home, and more generally use our housing stock that we have to really drive those numbers down as well. So with that, I think we can close our session and our conference for this year. I want to thank Deirdre for her chairing. I want to thank Aoife for her inspiring contribution, because I think the right to home is very dear to the heart of Simon, and Mercy Law have, as I say, had done a huge amount of work in that area, and that's, I think, was reflected in Aoife's contribution. And although Freck was a limited interjection, I think it was still useful and great to have him here. So again, thank you to everybody for attending. Please do, if you get the chance, have a look at the Take Action site, and do email your TD if you can. And yeah, with that, we will close. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.